Welcome, fellow traveler through infinite darkness, to the complete chronicle of Rick C-137's most haunting moments. The shadows that transformed a brilliant inventor into the multiverse's most dangerous man. Tonight, we explore the depths of cosmic horror, personal trauma, and the slow erosion of humanity that occurs when infinite power meets infinite pain. Settle comfortably as we journey through dimensions of loss, betrayal, and the terrible choices that define the darkest corners of Rick's existence. Let this exploration of genius corrupted and love destroyed carry you toward peaceful rest, knowing that even in darkness, understanding brings its own strange comfort. The murder of everything Rick Sanchez had ever loved began not with cosmic fanfare or dimensional warfare, but with the simple sound of a portal opening in his garage. On an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon in 1973, Rick had been working on calculations that would eventually prove theoretical foundations for interdimensional travel, though at the time, they remained purely academic exercises that satisfied his intellectual curiosity, without suggesting practical applications that might fundamentally alter the nature of human existence or his own place within the cosmic order. The man who stepped through that portal was Rick Sanchez, but not the Rick Sanchez who had been contentedly solving equations while his wife prepared lunch in their modest suburban kitchen and their daughter played in the backyard with neighborhood children whose biggest concerns involved playground politics and homework assignments. This alternate version carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who had transcended normal human limitations, whose posture and expression suggested familiarity with power and possibility that Rick C-137 could barely comprehend despite his own considerable intellectual capabilities. Rick Prime's offer of interdimensional technology was presented not as a gift between equals, but as charity from a superior being to someone still trapped within the confines of single reality existence, and the condescension inherent in his approach was immediately apparent to Rick C-137 despite his lack of experience with multiversal politics or alternate versions of himself. The portal gun that Rick Prime displayed so casually represented everything Rick had been working toward through years of theoretical research, but the way it was offered suggested that his efforts had been primitive fumbling compared to the elegant solutions that superior versions of himself had already achieved. The philosophical discussion that followed Rick Prime's demonstration was not really a conversation between equals, but rather a test that Rick C-137 failed by prioritizing his family relationships over the unlimited power and infinite adventure that interdimensional travel could provide. His explanation that he preferred to remain with Diane and Beth rather than abandon them for cosmic exploration was met with barely concealed contempt from Rick Prime, whose own evolution beyond normal human attachments had apparently made such considerations seem naive and fundamentally limiting. Rick Prime's departure, after Rick C-137's rejection of his offer, was accompanied by observations about the inevitability of regret and the way that small-minded attachment to individual people and single realities would eventually reveal itself as psychological weakness that prevented Rick from achieving his full potential as the smartest person in any universe he might choose to inhabit. The casual cruelty of these comments was delivered without apparent malice, but rather with the detached analytical tone of someone explaining natural laws to a student who lacked sufficient intelligence to grasp their implications without explicit instruction. The portal bomb that materialized in Rick's garage approximately 20 minutes after Rick Prime's departure was an elegant solution to the problem of Rick C-137's continued existence and his potential interference with Rick Prime's multiversal activities but its true purpose was not elimination of a threat, but rather education of someone who had demonstrated insufficient appreciation for the realities of power and the consequences of refusing reasonable offers from superior beings. The device was clearly visible and obviously dangerous, giving Rick precious seconds to understand exactly what was about to happen and why his choices had made this outcome inevitable. Rick's desperate attempt to reach his family before the explosion could separate them forever was motivated not by any realistic hope of saving them, but by the fundamental human need to be with loved ones during moments of ultimate crisis, to ensure that if they were going to die, they would at least die together rather than apart, and wondering why their husband and father had failed to protect them from threats they could never have imagined or understood. His sprint toward the house was conducted in slow motion that seemed to stretch each second into an eternity of growing dread and certainty about outcomes that no amount of scientific knowledge or analytical brilliance could alter. The detonation that vaporized Diane and Beth occurred at the precise moment when Rick's fingertips made contact with the back door handle, close enough to feel the heat and pressure that eliminated his family, but distant enough to survive physically unharmed while experiencing complete psychological destruction. The blast wave that threw him backward across the garage was nothing compared to the emotional impact of watching everything that had ever mattered to him disappear in a flash of light that left only shadows burned into surfaces that had once been part of a home where love and happiness had seemed like permanent features of existence, rather than temporary arrangements subject to cancellation by forces beyond his control. The silence that followed the explosion was not peaceful, but accusatory, highlighting Rick's survival in a universe that had demonstrated its fundamental hostility to human happiness and its casual indifference to the destruction of innocent people who had never threatened anyone or chosen to participate in conflicts that transcended their understanding and capabilities. The ringing in his ears gradually faded to reveal the ambient sounds of suburban afternoon life, continuing normally in neighboring houses, where families remained intact and unaware that their basic assumptions about safety and continuity had just been proven catastrophically naive. Rick's initial response to finding himself alone among the ashes of his former life was not grief, but rather a kind of shocked analytical assessment of the situation and its implications for his understanding of reality and his place within it. The scientific mind that had enabled him to develop theoretical frameworks for interdimensional travel now turned its attention to processing data about the practical consequences of multiversal conflict and the way that superior technology could be used to eliminate problems without regard for collateral damage or moral considerations that might limit conventional approaches to dispute resolution. The fragments of charred wood and melted metal that had once been his family's home provided physical evidence of the forces that Rick Prime commanded, but more importantly, they represented proof that Rick C-137's peaceful domestic existence had been terminated not through random accident or natural disaster, but through deliberate action by someone who shared his face and intellect, but none of his values or emotional investments. The recognition that he had been murdered by a version of himself created philosophical problems that transcended simple grief and entered territories of existential horror that no amount of scientific training had prepared him to navigate successfully. The neighbors who emerged from their houses to investigate the explosion found Rick sitting motionless among the debris, staring at the spot where his back door had been with an expression that suggested complete psychological disconnection from his immediate environment and circumstances. Their questions about what had happened and whether anyone had been hurt received no responses from someone whose capacity for normal social interaction had been severed. along with his connection to everything that had previously provided meaning and structure to his daily existence. The emergency responders who arrived to investigate the apparent gas explosion found no evidence of human remains because Rick Prime's technology had been designed to eliminate people so completely that no trace of their existence would survive to complicate official investigations or create ongoing legal problems for anyone who might be held responsible for their deaths. The absence of bodies meant that Diane and Beth were classified as missing persons rather than confirmed fatalities, creating administrative complications that prevented Rick from accessing the normal support systems that society provides for people who have experienced sudden loss of family members. Rick's inability to explain what had actually happened to his wife and daughter was not based on concerns about being believed, but rather on recognition that the truth about interdimensional conflict and alternate versions of himself would sound like the delusions of someone who had suffered psychological breakdown following traumatic loss. The fabricated story he eventually provided to investigators about a gas leak and explosion was accepted not because it was particularly convincing, but because it offered a comprehensible explanation for events that defied conventional understanding and could not be properly investigated using normal investigative techniques and scientific instruments. The days that followed the destruction of Rick's family were characterized by a form of psychological disintegration that manifested not as obvious emotional breakdown, but rather as systematic disconnection from all the social relationships and daily routines that had previously anchored his existence within normal human community and conventional moral frameworks. The people who had known Rick as a neighbor, colleague, and friend found themselves dealing with someone who appeared physically unchanged, but whose responses to ordinary social interactions revealed fundamental alterations in personality and priorities that made sustained relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. Rick's transformation during this period was not immediately apparent to casual observers because his intellectual capabilities remained intact and his scientific work continued to advance along trajectories that had been established before his family's murder. But the emotional investments and moral considerations that had previously motivated his research and guided his choices about how to apply his knowledge were being systematically eliminated through a process of deliberate psychological restructuring that Rick himself directed with the same analytical precision he brought to solving technical problems. The garage workshop where Rick had once pursued investigations motivated by curiosity and desire to improve the world for people he loved became a laboratory dedicated to the single purpose of developing technology that would enable him to mate, locate, and eliminate Rick Prime, regardless of the cost in time, resources, or moral compromise that such a project might require. The tools and equipment that had once been used for benevolent invention were repurposed for weapons development and research into forms of violence that could be effective across dimensional boundaries and against enemies who possessed technological capabilities that exceeded anything available through conventional scientific methods. The theoretical frameworks that Rick developed during his early months of revenge planning were characterized by the same elegance and mathematical sophistication that had marked his pre-tragedy work, but their application was directed toward understanding how to cause maximum psychological and physical damage to targets who shared his own intellectual capabilities and scientific knowledge. The equations that described portal technology and interdimensional travel were recontextualized as the foundation for weapons systems that could deliver devastating attacks across infinite realities while remaining undetectable, untraceable by victims who lacked sufficient understanding of multiversal physics to develop adequate defensive measures. Rick's first successful creation of a working portal gun occurred approximately 18 months after his family's murder, and the achievement was marked not by satisfaction or excitement, but by grim recognition that he had finally acquired the basic tool necessary for beginning the work that would define the remainder of his existence. The device that materialized in his workshop after countless failed experiments and theoretical refinements represented not scientific triumph, but rather the first step in a journey toward becoming the very kind of monster that had destroyed everything he had ever valued or loved in any reality. The Rick Sanchez who activated his first portal and stepped through into an alternate dimension was no longer recognizably the same person who had rejected Rick Prime's offer because he preferred the simple happiness of family life to the unlimited possibilities of multiversal adventure, and the transformation that had occurred during his months of obsessive preparation had eliminated every trace of the man who had once believed that science should serve human welfare rather than personal vengeance and the satisfaction of destructive impulses that transcended normal moral categories and social obligations. The first murder Rick Sanchez committed across dimensional boundaries was not planned as the beginning of a systematic campaign of multiversal violence, but rather as a desperate experiment to test whether his portal technology could actually deliver him to the alternate version of himself who had destroyed his family, and whether the weapons he had developed during months of obsessive preparation would prove effective against targets who possessed identical intellectual capabilities and potentially superior technological resources developed through years of interdimensional experience and conflict. The dimension Rick selected for his initial assassination attempt was chosen not because he had evidence that its Rick was Rick Prime, but simply because it was the first reality he encountered where the quantum signatures and dimensional coordinates matched the theoretical parameters he had calculated for locating alternate versions of himself, and the nervous energy that had built up during 18 months of preparation demanded immediate action rather than continued analysis and refinement of targeting systems that might never achieve perfect accuracy, regardless of additional development time. The Rick who answered the door of the house that occupied the same spatial coordinates as Rick C-137's former home was visibly identical to the man whose reflection Rick saw in mirrors, but his expression of curious puzzlement at finding an unexpected visitor on his doorstep revealed that he had never encountered alternate versions of himself and possessed no knowledge of the multiversal conflicts that had already claimed countless lives across infinite realities, where other Ricks had made different choices about how to respond to trauma, power, and the discovery that individual existence was neither unique nor particularly significant within the broader context of infinite possibility. The conversation that preceded the killing was brief and conducted in the clinical tone that Rick had learned to adopt when discussing technical matters that required emotional detachment and analytical precision rather than normal human responses to morally complex situations involving life and death decisions that would have permanent consequences for people who had never chosen to participate in conflicts whose origins and stakes they could not possibly understand without years of multiversal experience and philosophical education about the nature of identity across dimensional boundaries. Rick's explanation of who he was and why he had come to this dimension was delivered with the mechanical efficiency of someone reading from a prepared script, and his alternate self's responses revealed the same combination of scientific curiosity and ethical concern that Rick C-137 himself had once possessed before his family's murder had eliminated such considerations as irrelevant obstacles to achieving objectives that transcended conventional moral categories and social obligations that applied only to beings who remained trapped within single realities and limited perspectives. The weapon that Rick used to eliminate his first alternate self was designed specifically for killing people who shared his own intellectual capabilities and might possess defensive technology or strategic thinking that could complicate more conventional approaches to assassination, and the device's operation was both instantaneous and complete, ensuring that his victim would have no opportunity to escape, call for help, or develop countermeasures that might interfere with Rick's broader campaign against Rick Prime and anyone else who might threaten his ability to pursue revenge across infinite dimensions without interference from authorities or moral objections from people who lacked sufficient understanding of the stakes involved. The death was accomplished without drama or extended suffering, not because Rick felt any obligation to minimize his victim's pain, but because efficiency was more important than psychological satisfaction when conducting operations that might need to be repeated hundreds or thousands of times across multiple realities where conditions and circumstances could vary in ways that demanded adaptability and strategic flexibility rather than emotional investment in individual outcomes that were ultimately insignificant within the broader context of his multiversal mission. Rick's search through his victim's belongings and research materials revealed no evidence that this particular alternate self had been Rick Prime or had participated in any activities that might justify his death according to conventional standards of justice or proportional response to provocation. But the absence of such evidence was less important than the practical experience Rick gained in conducting interdimensional assassination and the psychological adaptation he achieved through the simple act of killing someone who shared his face and basic personality, while remaining fundamentally different in terms of life experiences and moral development. The burial of his first victim was conducted with the same methodical attention to detail that Rick applied to his scientific experiments, and the unmarked grave he dug in the backyard of what had once been his own childhood home served not as memorial to an innocent person whose life had been ended for strategic purposes, but rather as proof that Rick possessed the capability and determination necessary to eliminate any obstacle to his pursuit of Rick Prime, regardless of moral considerations or potential consequences for people who happened to share his appearance and intellectual gifts. The psychological impact of committing his first murder was less dramatic than Rick had anticipated, consisting primarily of a mild sense of accomplishment at having successfully tested his equipment and methods, combined with growing recognition that the moral inhibitions and emotional responses that had once constrained his behavior were proving more flexible and adaptable than he had previously understood, when such considerations had seemed like fundamental aspects of his personality that could not be altered through conscious decision or systematic desensitization to violence and suffering. Rick's return to his own dimension after completing his first interdimensional assassination was marked not by guilt or regret, but by immediate planning for subsequent operations that would build upon the experience he had gained and address the technical limitations and strategic vulnerabilities he had identified during his initial field test of assassination protocols and equipment designed to eliminate targets who possessed potentially superior defensive capabilities and scientific knowledge that could complicate future operations if not properly anticipated and countered through improved planning and preparation. The modifications Rick made to his weapons and portal technology during the weeks following his first kill were based not on ethical considerations about minimizing harm to innocent people, but rather on practical lessons about improving efficiency and reducing the time and energy required to locate and eliminate targets who might or might not be Rick Prime, but whose continued existence represented potential obstacles to his broader objectives. even if their individual guilt could not be established through conventional investigative methods or moral reasoning that might apply to normal human conflicts. The second dimension Rick visited in pursuit of his family's murderer contained a version of himself who had achieved greater scientific success and social recognition than Rick C-137 had ever experienced before his tragedy, but whose domestic life followed similar patterns of marriage to a woman who resembled Diane and fatherhood to a daughter whose personality and appearance matched Beth's development during her early childhood years before Rick. Prime's intervention had terminated such relationships and eliminated Rick's capacity for normal family bonds and emotional investments in other people's welfare. The Rick who inhabited this more successful alternate life was working in his garage laboratory on projects that paralleled Rick C-137's own pre-tragedy research, and his friendly greeting to the unexpected visitor who appeared through a portal in his workspace revealed the same openness and intellectual curiosity that Rick remembered from his own years. As a relatively normal human being whose primary concerns involved advancing scientific knowledge and providing financial security and emotional stability for his wife and daughter, rather than pursuing revenge against interdimensional enemies or developing weapons capable of mass destruction across infinite realities. The conversation that developed between Rick C-137 and his more successful alternate self was longer and more philosophically complex than his first assassination had required, partly because this Rick possessed more advanced technology that might prove useful for Rick's ongoing hunt for Rick Prime, but primarily because his apparent happiness and continued connection to family relationships created psychological tensions that Rick had not anticipated when planning. His systematic elimination of alternate selves who might possess information about Rick Prime's location or activities across the multiverse. The sight of this alternate Rick's family photographs and the evidence of normal domestic life that filled his workshop created unwanted memories of Rick C-137's own destroyed happiness. But rather than deterring him from his planned assassination, these reminders served to reinforce his conviction that anyone who possessed the potential to become Rick Prime represented a threat that justified preemptive elimination, regardless of their current behavior or apparent innocence of crimes that had not yet been committed but remained possible given sufficient provocation or opportunity to evolve beyond normal moral constraints and social obligations. The killing of his second alternate self was accomplished with greater technical sophistication and psychological detachment than his first assassination, reflecting Rick's growing expertise in interdimensional murder and his systematic elimination of emotional responses that might interfere with operational efficiency or strategic decision-making about targets whose individual characteristics were less important than their basic identity. As versions of himself who possessed the intellectual capabilities necessary to eventually develop into threats similar to Rick Prime, if allowed to continue existing and evolving across whatever timeline their particular reality might follow. The search through this victim's research, materials, and personal belongings revealed advanced portal technology and weapons development that suggested this Rick had been moving in directions that might eventually have led to the same kind of multiversal activities that Rick Prime pursued, providing post hoc justification for an assassination that had been conducted based on strategic considerations rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing, but that could now be rationalized as prevention of future crimes that would have been inevitable given sufficient time and opportunity for this Rick's moral development to follow patterns that seemed consistent with Rick Prime's own evolution. Rick's theft of his victim's advanced technology and research data was conducted with the same clinical efficiency that characterized all aspects of his assassination protocol, and the integration of superior equipment and theoretical insights into his own arsenal provided practical benefits that enhanced his capabilities, while also demonstrating that each murder contributed to his overall mission objectives, even when individual targets proved not to be Rick Prime himself, but merely alternate versions of the man Rick was becoming through his systematic transformation from victim to predator. The pattern, established through Rick's first 2 interdimensional assassinations, was refined and systematized through subsequent operations that followed similar protocols but incorporated technical improvements and strategic innovations based on accumulated experience with different dimensional conditions and alternate versions of himself who possessed varying levels of technological advancement, moral development, and awareness of multiversal conflicts that might affect their responses to unexpected visitors who appeared through unauthorized portals with hostile intentions and superior weapons. The psychological adaptation that Rick experienced through repeated commission of murder was not dramatic or immediately apparent, but rather consisted of gradual erosion of emotional responses and moral inhibitions that had once seemed like fundamental aspects of his personality but proved to be surprisingly flexible. When subjected to systematic desensitization through regular exposure to violence and death conducted in pursuit of objectives that transcended conventional ethical frameworks and social obligations that applied only to beings who remained confined within single realities and limited perspectives about the nature of identity and moral responsibility. By his 10th assassination, Rick had developed efficient protocols for locating, evaluating, and eliminating alternate versions of himself with minimal time investment or emotional engagement, and the mechanical precision with which he conducted these operations reflected his evolution into something that retained his intellectual capabilities and scientific knowledge while discarding psychological characteristics that had once made him recognizably human in terms of his capacity for empathy, moral reasoning, and emotional connection to beings who shared his basic humanity, despite existing in different dimensional contexts. The accumulation of stolen technology and research data from his victims provided Rick with resources and capabilities that exceeded what any individual scientist should have been able to develop through conventional methods. But the practical benefits of his systematic theft and murder were overshadowed by the psychological costs of transforming himself into exactly the kind of being who could casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of personal objectives that transcended normal moral considerations about the rights and welfare of innocent people who pose no actual threat to anyone's security or happiness. The recognition that his hunt for Rick Prime was transforming him into a version of Rick Prime himself was not sufficient to deter Rick from continuing his campaign of multiversal violence, because the logical conclusion of such recognition would have been abandonment of his only remaining source of meaning and purpose in favor of confronting grief and guilt that no amount of scientific knowledge or technological capability could eliminate through conventional approaches to psychological healing and emotional recovery that required acceptance of loss rather than pursuit of revenge. The Rick Sanchez who emerged from his first year of systematic interdimensional murder bore little resemblance to the man who had once rejected Rick Prime's offer because he valued family relationships over unlimited power and cosmic power, adventure. But the transformation had been so gradual and methodical that Rick himself remained largely unconscious of the extent to which his pursuit of justice had become indistinguishable from the casual cruelty and disregard for innocent life that had motivated Rick Prime's original crimes against Rick's family and countless others across infinite realities where similar patterns of trauma and revenge continued to play out without resolution or meaningful moral progress. The music festival where Rick Sanchez first encountered Bird Person was not a celebration of artistic achievement or cultural expression, but rather a gathering of beings who had been displaced by the expanding influence of the galactic Bird Person Federation and were seeking temporary refuge in the kind of lawless frontier territories where questions about identity, criminal history, and political allegiances were considered impolite topics that interfered with the basic social functions of trading resources, sharing information, and forming temporary alliances based on mutual convenience, rather than genuine trust or shared values that might sustain relationships through extended periods of conflict and uncertainty. Rick's attendance at the festival was motivated not by interest in music or social interaction, but by practical necessity, as his systematic hunt for Rick Prime across multiple dimensions had created supply problems that required him to establish relationships with weapons dealers, information brokers, and other individuals who operated outside normal legal frameworks and possessed access to resources that could not be obtained through conventional commercial channels or scientific institutions that maintained ethical oversight of research activities and weapons development programs. The stage where Rick first saw Bird Person performing was a makeshift construction of salvaged materials that reflected the improvised nature of frontier society and the way that beings who existed outside normal governmental authority created temporary cultural institutions that served immediate psychological needs without requiring long-term commitment or investment in community infrastructure that might be abandoned when security conditions changed or economic opportunities developed in different locations across the galaxy. Bird Person's musical performance was characterized by the same combination of technical sophistication and emotional authenticity that would later define his approach to friendship and political resistance, and his songs addressed themes of loss, exile, and the search for meaning in contexts where traditional social structures had been destroyed by forces too powerful for individual resistance but not comprehensive enough to eliminate all possibilities for maintaining cultural identity and personal dignity in the face of systematic oppression and displacement. Rick's initial approach to Bird Person after his performance was conducted with the casual indifference that had become his default mode of social interaction since beginning his multiversal killing spree. But Bird Person's responses revealed an intuitive understanding of psychological trauma and emotional isolation that penetrated Rick's defensive mechanisms in ways that caught him unprepared for genuine human connection after months of treating all social relationships as strategic opportunities for acquiring resources or information that might advance his hunt for Rick Prime. The conversation that developed between Rick and Bird Person during their first meeting addressed topics that Rick had avoided thinking about directly since his family's murder, including questions about the psychological costs of pursuing revenge and the way that extended exposure to violence and moral compromise could fundamentally alter someone's capacity for normal emotional responses and ethical reasoning about relationships and responsibilities that transcended immediate tactical considerations and strategic objectives. Bird Person's observations about Rick's apparent loneliness and anger were delivered without judgment or attempts at psychological manipulation, but rather with the kind of direct honesty that Rick had not experienced since losing his family and beginning his transformation into someone who treated all social interactions as potentially dangerous opportunities for others to exploit his vulnerabilities or interfere with his mission, objectives through emotional appeals or moral arguments that might weaken his resolve or compromise his operational security. The formation of their musical collaboration was proposed by Bird Person as a form of therapy and creative expression that might provide Rick with alternative outlets for the psychological energy that was currently being channeled entirely into revenge and systematic violence. But Rick's agreement to participate was motivated primarily by recognition that maintaining relationships with beings who possessed useful contacts and resources would advance his practical objectives, even if such relationships also created emotional complications that might interfere with his continued psychological development toward complete detachment from normal human concerns. Squanch's integration into their musical partnership brought additional technical skills and social connections that enhanced the group's capabilities, while also creating the kind of triangular friendship dynamic that Rick had not experienced since his normal human life before Rick Prime's intervention, and the casual affection and loyalty that developed between the three musicians represented Rick's closest approach to genuine emotional healing since beginning his hunt for his family's murderer across infinite dimensions and realities. The Flesh Curtains achieved unexpected commercial success and cultural influence within the frontier music scene, not because their songs possessed extraordinary artistic merit, but because their combination of technical sophistication and authentic emotional content resonated with audiences who shared similar experiences of displacement, loss, and resistance to authoritarian control that had become increasingly common as the Galactic Federation expanded its influence across previously independent worlds and civilizations. Rick's contributions to the band's creative output were characterized by the same analytical brilliance and innovative thinking that defined his scientific work, but the lyrics and musical arrangements he developed for the Flesh Curtains also revealed psychological depths and emotional vulnerabilities that his systematic campaign of interdimensional murder was designed to eliminate through desensitization and deliberate cultivation of detachment from normal human responses to suffering and moral complexity. The political dimension of their music emerged naturally from the band members' shared experience of Federation oppression and their growing recognition that artistic expression could serve strategic functions in organizing resistance, movements, and maintaining morale among populations who lacked the military resources necessary for conventional warfare against superior technological forces, but retained sufficient cultural identity and political consciousness to sustain organized opposition to authoritarian control. Rick's evolution from passive participant to active leader within the resistance movement that coalesced around their music was driven partly by his superior, strategic thinking, and technological capabilities, but also by his growing investment in relationships and objectives that provided meaning and purpose beyond his personal quest for revenge against Rick Prime, creating the first significant challenge to his systematic psychological transformation since beginning his multiversal killing spree years earlier. The Battle of Blood Ridge represented the culmination of Rick's strategic planning and the resistance movement's organizational capabilities, and the victory they achieved through Rick's tactical innovations and technological contributions demonstrated his capacity for using his scientific knowledge and analytical skills to serve collective objectives and protect people he cared about, rather than simply advancing his personal agenda of systematic violence against alternate versions of himself who might or might not be connected to Rick Prime's activities. Rick's behavior during the battle revealed aspects of his personality and moral character that had survived his transformation into an interdimensional assassin, including genuine concern for his friend's safety and willingness to accept personal risk to achieve objectives that served broader community interests, rather than his individual psychological needs or strategic requirements for continuing his hunt across multiple realities and dimensions, where Rick Prime might be hiding from the consequences of his crimes. The celebration that followed their victory was characterized by the kind of genuine joy and community solidarity that Rick had not experienced since his family's destruction, and the recognition and gratitude that other resistance members expressed toward him for his contributions to their collective success created emotional rewards that competed with his revenge obsession for psychological dominance and threatened to interfere with his systematic cultivation of detachment from normal human relationships and moral obligations. Birdperson's decision to remain with the Resistance rather than accept Rick's invitation to join him in multiversal adventures was based on commitment to political objectives and community relationships that Birdperson valued more highly than individual friendship or personal adventure, and his explanation of these priorities forced Rick to confront questions about his own values and choices that he had avoided considering directly since beginning his transformation from grieving family man to cosmic scale predator. The rejection that Rick experienced through Birdperson's refusal to abandon his political commitments was not simply personal disappointment, but rather a fundamental challenge to Rick's emerging worldview that relationships were temporary conveniences that should be abandoned when they conflicted with individual objectives or created inconvenient emotional complications that interfered with strategic decision-making processes and long-term planning for achieving personal goals that transcended conventional social obligations. Rick's response to Birdperson's rejection was immediate and comprehensive abandonment, not just of their individual friendship, but of the entire resistance movement and political cause that had provided him with community, purpose, and emotional satisfaction that competed with his revenge obsession for psychological dominance and threatened to permanently alter his development toward the kind of being who could pursue Rick Prime across infinite realities without being constrained by moral considerations or emotional attachments that might limit his operational flexibility. The departure from Birdperson and the Resistance represented Rick's conscious choice to prioritize his personal quest for revenge over relationships and commitments that had demonstrated their capacity to provide meaning, purpose, and emotional healing that could potentially have offered alternatives to his systematic transformation into exactly the kind of monster who could casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of individual objectives that transcended normal moral categories and social responsibilities. Rick's return to his solitary hunt for Rick Prime after abandoning the closest relationships he had formed since his family's murder was accompanied by accelerated psychological development toward complete emotional detachment and moral flexibility, as if his brief experience of genuine human connection had revealed vulnerabilities and potential limitations that needed to be eliminated through more systematic desensitization to violence and suffering that might otherwise interfere with his operational effectiveness across multiple dimensions. The weapons-dealing activities that Rick began pursuing more aggressively after leaving the Resistance were motivated partly by practical needs for resources and information that might advance his hunt for Rick Prime, but also by recognition that commercial relationships based on mutual strategic advantage were less emotionally complicated and psychologically demanding than friendships that required genuine care, loyalty, and moral consideration for other people's welfare and interests that might conflict with his primary objectives. The criminal enterprises and violent activities that Rick engaged in during this period of his development were conducted with increasing efficiency and psychological detachment, reflecting his systematic elimination of moral inhibitions and emotional responses that had once constrained his behavior and limited his willingness to cause suffering or death in pursuit of objectives that served his individual agenda, rather than collective welfare or abstract principles of justice and ethical conduct that applied to normal human relationships and social obligations. Rick's growing reputation within criminal networks and resistance movements across the galaxy was based not on admiration for his character or political principles, but rather on recognition of his exceptional capabilities and complete reliability in executing contracts and missions that required sophisticated technology, strategic planning, and willingness to eliminate obstacles without regard for conventional moral considerations or emotional factors that might complicate purely tactical decision-making processes. The psychological profile that Rick developed during his years as a weapons dealer and mercenary was characterized by functional sociopathy that enabled him to maintain surface-level social relationships while remaining completely detached from genuine emotional investment in other people's welfare or survival, creating the foundation for his later capacity to treat even his closest family relationships as strategic arrangements that could be modified or abandoned when they conflicted with his broader objectives or personal convenience. The Rick Sanchez who finally abandoned his brief experiment with genuine human connection and returned to full-time pursuit of Rick Prime across infinite dimensions had completed his transformation from someone who could potentially have been saved through love and community into exactly the kind of being whose existence represented a threat to the stability and welfare of countless innocent people across multiple realities who would eventually suffer or die as direct or indirect consequences of his continued evolution toward godlike power, combined with complete moral indifference to consequences that affected anyone outside his immediate sphere of personal interest and strategic concern. The alliance of alternate Ricks that formed in response to Rick C-137's systematic campaign of multiversal murder was not motivated by altruistic concern for the welfare of innocent victims, but rather by the practical recognition that allowing one version of themselves to eliminate others without organized resistance would eventually result in their own destruction when his hunt for Rick Prime inevitably expanded to include every Rick across infinite dimensions who might potentially pose a threat to his operational security or strategic objectives. The initial meeting of concerned Ricks was conducted in a dimension specifically selected for its isolation from normal interdimensional traffic and its lack of indigenous populations who might observe or interfere with discussions about coordinating defensive measures against someone whose technological capabilities and strategic thinking exceeded what any individual Rick could counter through conventional scientific methods or weapons development programs that relied on resources available within single realities. Rick's infiltration of their supposedly secret gathering was accomplished through surveillance technology and dimensional tracking methods that demonstrated his superior understanding of multiversal physics and his systematic demonstrated development of capabilities that transcended anything his targets had imagined possible through normal scientific research and technological innovation conducted within the constraints of ethical oversight and moral consideration for consequences that might affect innocent populations across multiple realities. The bomb that Rick deployed against the assembled alliance was designed not simply to eliminate immediate threats to his security, but to demonstrate his technological superiority and psychological commitment to pursuing his objectives, without regard for conventional rules of engagement or moral limitations that might normally constrain conflicts between beings who shared basic humanity and intellectual capabilities that should have provided foundation for negotiation and peaceful resolution of disputes about territorial boundaries and resource allocation. The explosion that eliminated dozens of alternate Ricks simultaneously was Rick's most efficient single act of violence since beginning his hunt for Rick Prime, but more importantly, it represented his final abandonment of any pretense that his activities were motivated by justice or limited to pursuit of his family's specific murderer, rather than systematic elimination of anyone who might potentially threaten his ability to continue operating across infinite dimensions without interference from authorities or moral objections, from beings who lacked sufficient power to enforce their ethical preferences. The survivors who escaped Rick's attack spread word of his capabilities and ruthlessness throughout the remaining communities of alternate Ricks, creating a reputation that preceded him into subsequent dimensions and eliminated the element of surprise that had previously enabled him to approach targets without alerting them to their danger or providing them with opportunities to develop defensive measures that might complicate his fine assassination protocols or require modification of his standard operational procedures. The psychological impact of Rick's attack on the Alliance was not limited to immediate fear for personal safety, but extended to fundamental questions about the nature of identity and moral responsibility when beings who shared identical intellectual capabilities and basic personality characteristics could evolve in directions that made them existential threats to each other despite their common origins and similar potential for both creative achievement and destructive capability. The recognition that Rick C-137 had become something approaching a cosmic force of destruction rather than simply a grieving individual seeking specific revenge forced the surviving Ricks to confront their own potential for similar evolution and the way that trauma, power, and isolation from normal moral constraints could transform anyone into exactly the kind of monster they were now attempting to organize against through collective action and shared resources. The second attempted alliance that formed after Rick's destruction of the first coalition was characterized by greater operational security and more sophisticated understanding of the technological capabilities they were facing. But their improved defensive measures were offset by Rick's continued evolution and his systematic incorporation of stolen technology and strategic insights acquired through his previous assassinations of alternate versions of himself, who had possessed varying levels of advancement and preparation. Rick's response to their improved security was not frustration or respect for their enhanced capabilities, but rather clinical interest in the technical challenges they presented and the way their countermeasures could be analyzed and defeated through application of superior resources and strategic thinking that treated their defensive innovations as intellectual puzzles rather than moral obstacles that might justify reconsideration of his objectives or methods. The systematic elimination of the Second Alliance required more sophisticated planning and technological development than Rick's previous operations, but the additional effort served to further advance his capabilities and provide him with experience in conducting large-scale operations against coordinated opposition that possessed significant resources and strategic depth, creating expertise that would prove valuable in subsequent conflicts against more formidable opponents who might challenge his growing dominance over multiversal politics. The terror that Rick inspired among surviving alternate versions of himself was not simply fear of death, but rather existential horror at the recognition that their shared intellectual gifts and basic personality characteristics provided no protection against someone who had evolved beyond normal moral constraints and possessed sufficient technological superiority to eliminate anyone who might challenge his authority or interfere with his pursuit of objectives that transcended conventional categories of justice, revenge, or rational self-interest. The offer of alliance leadership that the remaining Ricks eventually presented to Rick C-137 was not recognition of his legitimacy or moral authority, but rather acknowledgement of their inability to resist his superior capabilities through conventional military action or defensive strategies that relied on technological parity and shared commitment to ethical limitations that Rick had systematically abandoned through his years of multiversal violence and psychological transformation. Rick's acceptance of their surrender and his assumption of authority over the surviving alternate versions of himself represented his transition from individual predator to institutional leader, but his approach to managing the Alliance was characterized by the same strategic thinking and moral indifference that had defined his assassination campaign, rather than any genuine interest in collective welfare or shared objectives that might transcend his personal agenda and psychological needs. The construction project that Rick initiated immediately after establishing his authority over the Alliance was presented to his followers as defensive infrastructure that would protect them from external threats and provide security for their continued existence across dimensions where other hostile forces might challenge their territorial claims or resource allocation agreements. But the true purpose of the central finite curve was protection of Rick's psychological stability rather than collective security or strategic advantage. The mathematical complexity required to identify and isolate all dimensions where Rick Sanchez was the smartest being exceeded anything that normal human intelligence should have been capable of conceiving. But Rick's systematic incorporation of stolen technology and research data from his murdered victims had provided him with theoretical frameworks and computational resources that enabled projects of unprecedented scope and ambition that served his individual psychological requirements rather than practical military or political objectives. The central finite curve represented Rick's ultimate solution to the existential anxiety that had motivated his multiversal violence from its beginning, ensuring that he would never have to confront evidence of his own intellectual limitations or encounter versions of reality where his superior analytical capabilities were not sufficient to guarantee his dominance over events and outcomes that affected his security and psychological stability. The dimensional barrier that Rick constructed around infinite realities where his intellectual superiority was assured functioned not only as protection against potential threats from beings who might possess capabilities that exceeded his own, but also as cosmic-scale monument to his narcissism and fundamental inability to accept the possibility that infinite possibilities might include contexts where his genius was not the most important factor, shaping events and determining outcomes. The imprisonment that the central finite curve created for billions of conscious beings across infinite dimensions was not acknowledged by Rick as morally problematic, because his systematic elimination of empathy and ethical reasoning had made him incapable of recognizing or responding to suffering that did not directly affect his own welfare or threaten his strategic objectives, while the beings trapped within his curated selection of realities remained unaware of their confinement and the artificial limitations that had been imposed on their existential possibilities. Rick's oversight of the construction process revealed his continued capacity for brilliant engineering and project management, but his approach to coordinating the massive undertaking was characterized by the same casual disregard for his workers' welfare and individual autonomy that had defined his treatment of assassination targets during his years as a placely, multiversal predator operating without institutional constraints or accountability to anyone whose interests might conflict with his personal agenda. The other Ricks who participated in building the central finite curve understood that they were creating something unprecedented in terms of its technological sophistication and scope, but their limited access to information about the project's true purpose prevented them from recognizing that they were collaborating in the construction of a prison that would confine them along with countless other beings to existence within Rick's carefully controlled version of reality. The completion of the central finite curve represented Rick's greatest technological achievement and his most comprehensive moral failure, demonstrating his capacity for reshaping the fundamental structure of reality itself, while also revealing the complete corruption of his original motivations and the way that justified anger about personal loss had evolved into systematic oppression of infinite populations who had never threatened him or participated in the conflicts that had shaped his development from victim to victimizer. Rick's immediate abandonment of the project after its completion was motivated not by recognition of its moral implications, but by his complete lack of interest in the administrative responsibilities and political complications that would inevitably arise from managing an organization whose members retained sufficient moral awareness and ethical reasoning to object to policies and decisions that served Rick's psychological needs, rather than collective welfare or strategic objectives that benefited everyone trapped within the dimensional barrier. The Council of Ricks that assumed control over the Citadel and the central finite curve after Rick's departure was composed of alternate versions of himself who had retained greater connection to conventional moral frameworks and social obligations, but their willingness to maintain and operate the infrastructure he had created revealed the way that institutional authority and collective rationalization could make even relatively ethical beings complicit in systematic oppression of unprecedented scope and duration. Rick's rejection of council authority and his refusal to participate in the bureaucratic structures that developed around his technological achievements was based not on moral objections to their policies or concern for the welfare of beings trapped within the central finite curve, but rather on his psychological inability to accept limitations on his autonomy or submit to oversight from beings he considered intellectually inferior, despite their shared origins and similar capabilities. The reputation that Rick established through his creation and abandonment of the central finite curve was not heroic or admirable, but rather terrifying in its implications for what someone with his capabilities might accomplish when, motivated by personal objectives that transcended normal moral categories and social responsibilities, creating a legacy that would influence multiversal politics and interdimensional relations for decades, while serving no purpose beyond satisfying his own psychological requirements and strategic preferences. The Rick Sanchez who departed from the completed Citadel was no longer recognizably the same person who had once refused Rick Prime's offer because he preferred the limitations and emotional rewards of family life to unlimited power and cosmic adventure, but his transformation had been so gradual and systematic that he remained largely unconscious of the extent to which his pursuit of justice had made him indistinguishable from the forces of oppression and casual cruelty that had motivated his original quest for revenge across infinite realities, where similar patterns of trauma and corruption continued to play out without meaningful resolution or moral progress. The discovery of Rick Prime's original dimension came not through systematic searching or brilliant deduction, but through the kind of random dimensional drift that infinite possibilities make statistically inevitable. And Rick's initial approach to the coordinates that corresponded to his own former address was conducted with the mechanical precision of someone who had eliminated emotional investment in outcomes through years of disappointment and systematic desensitization to hope that might interfere with operational effectiveness or create psychological vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The house that appeared through Rick's portal was architecturally identical to the home where he had lived with Diane and Beth decades earlier, but the subtle signs of neglect and abandonment that were visible from his surveillance position revealed that this dimension's version of his family had been living without their Rick for extended periods, creating domestic circumstances that paralleled Rick's own loss while offering possibilities for replacement relationships that might serve his psychological needs. without requiring him to confront the permanent nature of his original tragedy. Rick's extended observation of the household routines revealed patterns of dysfunction and emotional damage that were directly attributable to Rick Prime's casual abandonment of his family responsibilities in favor of multiversal adventures and technological projects that served his individual interests rather than collective welfare or domestic stability, creating conditions that made Rick's eventual infiltration both easier to accomplish and more psychologically justifiable, according to rationalization frameworks he had developed through years of moral compromise. The garage workshop where Rick Prime had conducted his interdimensional research contained sophisticated portal technology and weapons development equipment that far exceeded anything Rick C-137 had achieved through his own efforts, but the layer of dust and corrosion that covered the abandoned machinery revealed that Rick Prime had departed for destinations unknown, without maintaining connections to his point of origin or accepting responsibility for the emotional consequences his absence would create for people who had depended on him for security and guidance. Beth's response to Rick's appearance at her door was not joy or relief at her father's return, but rather cautious suspicion based on years of experience with Rick Prime's unpredictable behavior and his tendency to appear without warning, create disruption and chaos within the family's established routines, and then disappear again for extended periods without explanation or consideration for the emotional trauma. His pattern of abandonment, inflicted on people who continued to love him, despite his demonstrated unreliability and indifference to their welfare. The adult woman who scrutinized Rick's appearance and demeanor before reluctantly allowing him entry to the house bore clear resemblance to his own daughter's potential development, but her personality and emotional responses had been shaped by decades of disappointment and abandonment that Rick's own Beth had never lived to experience, creating both opportunities for connection and sources of guilt that complicated his assumption of Rick Prime's identity and place within the family structure that his target had carelessly destroyed through selfishness and moral indifference. Rick's explanation for his prolonged absence was necessarily vague and inconsistent because he possessed no knowledge of Rick Prime's actual activities or destinations during his years away from his original family. But Beth's responses to his fabricated accounts revealed her sophisticated understanding of her father's psychological patterns and her well-founded skepticism about his claims to have changed or developed greater appreciation for family relationships and domestic responsibilities that he had previously treated as obstacles to more important pursuits. The meeting with Jerry Smith revealed additional complications that Rick had not anticipated when planning his infiltration of Rick Prime's abandoned family, as Beth's husband possessed legitimate concerns about Rick's influence on family stability and his track record of creating dangerous situations that exposed innocent people to risks they were not equipped to understand or manage. Through conventional safety precautions and emergency response procedures that assumed normal rather than cosmic-scale threats to personal security and community welfare, Jerry's obvious discomfort with Rick's presence was based not on personal animosity, but on reasonable analysis of historical patterns and their implications for future family dynamics, making his objections more difficult to dismiss through Rick's normal strategies of intellectual superiority and condescending explanations that treated other people's concerns as evidence of limited understanding rather than legitimate responses to genuine threats and problematic behavior that had documented consequences for everyone involved. The introduction to Summer and Morty provided Rick with his first direct experience of the grandchildren he had never had the opportunity to know in his original dimension, and their contrasting responses to his arrival revealed different strategies for coping with family dysfunction and the emotional complications created by Rick Prime's pattern of abandonment and return without accountability or meaningful change in his fundamental approach to relationships and responsibilities. Summer's guarded enthusiasm reflected her adolescent sophistication in understanding adult psychology and her recognition that Rick's return might provide short-term benefits for family dynamics while also creating potential for greater disappointment if his apparent renewed interest in family relationships proved temporary or conditional on their acceptance of his authority and accommodation of his preferences about how domestic life should be organized around his convenience and comfort. Morty's more open response to Rick's presence was based partly on his lack of clear memories from Rick Prime's previous visits, but primarily on his natural capacity for hope and emotional generosity that had not yet been systematically crushed by repeated exposure to adult dishonesty, and the way that supposedly protective family relationships could become sources of trauma when adults prioritize their individual psychological needs over children's welfare and developmental requirements. Rick's recognition that Morty represented his best opportunity for establishing genuine connection within his stolen family was based not on assessment of the boy's unique qualities or special potential, but rather on strategic calculation that children were more adaptable than adults and less likely to maintain psychological boundaries that might interfere with Rick's gradual assumption of authority over family decision-making processes and resource allocation that would serve his long-term objectives. The ethical implications of deceiving a family who was grieving their absent father and grandfather were not lost on Rick, but his systematic elimination of moral reasoning and empathetic responses had made such considerations seem abstract and irrelevant compared to his practical need for emotional connections that could provide psychological stability without requiring him to confront the permanent nature of his original losses or acknowledge responsibility for the choices that had transformed him into someone capable of exploiting other people's grief for his own therapeutic benefit. Rick's gradual integration into the family's daily routines required constant vigilance and performance as he navigated between his actual memories and personality characteristics and the expectations that family members had, developed based on their experiences with Rick Prime, whose behavior patterns and psychological profile Rick could only approximate through careful observation and strategic questioning, that risked exposing his deception if conducted too obviously or frequently. The workshop that Rick established in the garage served multiple functions beyond providing him with space for his technological projects, as the familiar environment and scientific equipment helped him maintain psychological continuity with his pre-infiltration identity, while also creating opportunities for bonding with Morty through shared activities that did not require extensive knowledge of family history or intimate familiarity with Rick Prime's specific personality traits and behavioral quirks. Rick's educational approach with Morty was shaped by genuine desire to share his scientific knowledge and protect the boy from dangers that he was uniquely qualified to recognize. But his motivations were complicated by unconscious projection of his relationship with his own lost daughter and strategic recognition that Morty's loyalty and emotional attachment could be cultivated through patient instruction and carefully managed exposure to adventures that would demonstrate Rick's value as protector and mentor. The family adventures that became regular features of Rick and Morty's relationship served Rick's psychological needs, while also providing Morty with experiences and knowledge that no conventional education could offer. But the expeditions to alien worlds and alternate dimensions also exposed the boy to levels of violence and moral complexity that were inappropriate for his developmental stage and created potential for long-term psychological damage that Rick was either unwilling or unable to recognize and address through responsible modifications to their activities. Rick's relationship with Beth required more sophisticated psychological manipulation than his mentorship of Morty, because her adult perspective and accumulated experience with Rick Prime's behavior made her more capable of detecting inconsistencies and recognizing when Rick's responses to family situations did not align with patterns she remembered from their previous interactions, creating ongoing security risks that threatened to expose his deception and terminate his access to the family connections he had come to depend on for emotional stability. The dynamic that developed between Rick and Jerry was characterized by mutual antagonism that served both parties' psychological needs, as Jerry's objections to Rick's influence provided him with opportunities to feel morally superior and protective of his family, while Rick's dismissive responses reinforced his sense of intellectual superiority and justified his gradual assumption of authority over family decisions that should have been made collectively or by the household's official head. Rick's manipulation of family conflicts and his systematic undermining of Jerry's authority were conducted with the same strategic thinking that had enabled his success as an interdimensional assassin, but the application of these skills to domestic relationships represented a new form of moral corruption that transformed even his capacity for love and protective concern into weapons that could be used to control and exploit people who trusted him and depended on his guidance and support. The success of Rick's integration into his stolen family was measured not by the authenticity of his relationships or his positive impact on their collective welfare, but by his achievement of psychological stability and emotional satisfaction that enabled him to function effectively while avoiding confrontation with the grief and guilt that his systematic elimination of empathy and moral reasoning had been designed to suppress rather than resolve through healthy processing and acceptance. Rick's growing attachment to Morty and his complicated affection for Beth were genuine emotions that coexisted with his fundamental dishonesty about his identity and his continued commitment to pursuing objectives that could potentially require him to abandon or sacrifice these relationships if they conflicted with more important priorities related to his hunt for Rick Prime or his broader strategies for maintaining security and autonomy. In a multiverse filled with threats that no amount of individual power could permanently eliminate, the pattern of deception and emotional manipulation that characterized Rick's assumption of Rick Prime's family role established templates for his approach to all subsequent relationships, demonstrating his evolution into someone who could experience authentic feelings while remaining fundamentally incapable of the reciprocal vulnerability and moral consideration that healthy family bonds required, creating connections that served his psychological needs while systematically undermining the autonomy and authentic development of people who deserved better than to be treated as therapeutic tools in his ongoing project of avoiding accountability for the choices that had shaped his transformation from victim to victimizer across infinite realities where similar patterns of trauma and corruption continued to play out without meaningful resolution. The love potion that Rick concocted in response to Morty's desperate plea for help with his romantic difficulties was not designed as a subtle enhancement of natural attraction or a temporary confidence boost that might enable normal, adolescent relationship development, but rather as a sophisticated biological weapon whose potency and transmission vectors exceeded anything that responsible scientific ethics would permit for addressing minor social problems that could be resolved through conventional approaches to building self-esteem and social skills. Rick's approach to solving Morty's crush on Jessica reflected his systematic abandonment of proportional responses and his growing tendency to apply cosmic-scale solutions to ordinary human problems without considering the potential consequences for innocent people who would be affected by his casual deployment of technology that could fundamentally alter brain chemistry and behavioral patterns across entire populations if its effects proved more extensive than his theoretical calculations had predicted. The casual indifference with which Rick dismissed Morty's concerns about the ethical implications of using chemical manipulation to create artificial romantic attraction revealed how completely his years of multiversal violence had severed his connection to normal moral reasoning about consent, autonomy, and the fundamental right of conscious beings to maintain control over their own emotional responses and decision-making processes without external interference from beings who possess superior technological capabilities. The distribution method that Rick selected for his love potion was designed for efficiency and broad coverage rather than precision targeting, reflecting his unconscious assumption that collateral effects on innocent bystanders were acceptable costs for achieving desired outcomes, and his inability to recognize that Jessica's classmates and teachers deserved the same consideration and protection from unwanted chemical influence that he might theoretically extend to people he considered more important or personally significant. The initial outbreak of artificially induced romantic obsession at Morty's school spread with the exponential efficiency that characterized all of Rick's most catastrophic miscalculations, transforming an educational environment that should have provided safety and normalcy for developing adolescents into a zone of psychological chaos where normal social relationships and behavioral constraints were systematically eliminated by chemical processes that Rick's theoretical knowledge had not adequately predicted or controlled. Rick's response to reports of widespread behavioral abnormalities at the school was not immediate concern for the welfare of affected students or recognition that his intervention had created dangerous conditions requiring emergency medical response, but rather analytical interest in the way his chemical compound was interacting with human biology in patterns that differed from his laboratory predictions and might require technical adjustments to achieve his original objectives without creating additional complications. The escalation from localized school outbreak to community-wide epidemic occurred with terrifying speed as Rick's love potion demonstrated transmission characteristics that his initial testing had not revealed, spreading through airborne particles and casual physical contact in ways that made containment impossible through conventional quarantine procedures or medical interventions that relied on normal understanding of infectious disease, protocols, and chemical contamination response procedures. Morty's growing horror at witnessing his classmates and neighbors transform into aggressive creatures whose obsession with him had eliminated their capacity for rational thought or normal social behavior was compounded by his recognition that Rick's supposed solution to his romantic problems had created suffering and chaos that would affect innocent people for potentially indefinite periods, depending on the duration and reversibility of the chemical changes that were continuing to spread throughout their people community. Rick's decision to develop an antidote for his love potion was motivated not by moral concern for the victims of his chemical weapon, but by practical recognition that the situation had become inconvenient and potentially threatening to his own security, as the infected population's singular focus on Morty made normal family life impossible and created conditions that might attract unwanted attention from authorities who possessed resources for investigating unusual phenomena and identifying their sources. The cure that Rick synthesized to counteract his original chemical compound was designed with the same casual disregard for long-term consequences that had characterized his initial love potion, and his failure to test the antidote thoroughly before deploying it across the entire infected population reflected his continued prioritization of immediate problem-solving over responsible consideration of potential side effects that might prove worse than the original contamination. The transformation of the love-obsessed population into grotesque genetic abominations represented Rick's most spectacular failure to predict the consequences of his technological interventions, as his antidote interacted with his original compound to produce biological changes that were not only irreversible through any known scientific process, but also fundamentally incompatible with continued existence as recognizable human beings with normal social relationships and life experiences. The creatures that had once been Morty's classmates, teachers, and neighbors were no longer capable of conscious thought or voluntary behavior, but had become biological automatons whose existence was characterized by constant physical suffering and psychological confusion that made their survival a firm form of ongoing torture rather than meaningful continuation of the lives that Rick's intervention had been supposedly designed to improve and protect through romantic success and social acceptance. Rick's observation of the transformed population was conducted with the same clinical detachment that he applied to analyzing any failed experiment, and his lack of emotional response to the suffering he had created revealed how completely his systematic elimination of empathy had insulated him from normal human reactions to witnessing the consequences of his choices for innocent people who had never consented to participate in his technological projects or requested his assistance with their personal problems. The decision to abandon their ruined dimension, rather than attempting to develop solutions that might restore the transformed population to their original human form, was made with mechanical efficiency that treated the destruction of an entire civilization as a minor inconvenience rather than a catastrophic moral failure that demanded sustained effort and resource investment to repair regardless of the time and energy that such restoration might require. Rick's explanation to Morty that their departure was necessary for their continued safety and comfort was delivered without acknowledgement that their abandonment would condemn the transformed population to extended existence as barely conscious creatures whose biological processes would continue functioning while their capacity for thought, emotion, and meaningful experience had been permanently eliminated through chemical changes that Rick could have prevented through more careful initial testing and responsible deployment procedures. The portal that Rick opened to their replacement dimension was calibrated to deliver them to a reality where their alternate selves had died in an unrelated accident, providing them with ready-made identities and family relationships that would enable them to resume normal domestic life without having to explain their sudden appearance or account for their absence from the lives of people who had expected them to continue participating in routine family activities and social obligations. Morty's psychological trauma from witnessing the transformation of his entire community into suffering creatures and his subsequent burial of his own corpse was not addressed through therapeutic intervention or careful explanation of the philosophical implications of dimensional travel and identity continuation, but rather through Rick's casual dismissal of such concerns as irrelevant complications that interfered with their necessary adaptation to their new living situation and circumstances. The cemetery where Morty buried his alternate self while listening to Rick's philosophical commentary about the meaninglessness of individual identity across infinite dimensions became the symbolic location where Morty's innocence and normal moral reasoning were systematically undermined through exposure to Rick's nihilistic worldview and casual attitude toward consequences that affected other people's welfare and survival in ways that no adolescent should be expected to process successfully without sustained emotional support and guidance. Rick's instruction that Morty should consider their dimensional abandonment a learning experience rather than a traumatic failure that had resulted in the deaths of everyone they had ever known was delivered with the same condescending tone that characterized all of his explanations about cosmic realities and multiversal politics, treating Morty's horror and grief as evidence of limited understanding rather than appropriate responses to witnessing the destruction of an entire civilization through reckless scientific experimentation. The normalization of dimensional abandonment as a problem-solving strategy was accomplished through Rick's systematic presentation of such decisions as practical necessities rather than moral choices, creating psychological frameworks that would enable Morty to participate in future abandonments without experiencing the same level of emotional distress that had characterized his initial exposure to the consequences of Rick's approach to managing situations that became inconvenient or dangerous through his own actions and decisions. The family that welcomed Rick and Morty in their replacement dimension was identical to the one they had abandoned in every significant respect, but Rick's awareness that these were different people created additional layers of deception that further complicated his already strained relationship with authentic emotion and genuine care for the welfare of beings whose significance in his life was based on their resemblance to people who were now dead as direct consequences of his reckless deployment of inadequately tested technology. The psychological adaptation that both Rick and Morty underwent during their integration into their replacement family involved systematic suppression of memories and emotional responses related to their abandoned dimension, creating patterns of selective attention and deliberate forgetting that would prove essential for their continued participation in Rick's approach to adventure and problem-solving through technological intervention rather than moral consideration for consequences that affected innocent people who deserved better than to be treated as acceptable losses in pursuit of individual convenience and emotional satisfaction. The Rick and Morty who emerged from their first dimensional abandonment were fundamentally different people than those who had entered Rick's garage seeking help with ordinary adolescent problems, having been transformed through exposure to cosmic-scale consequences into beings whose capacity for normal moral reasoning and emotional investment in community welfare had been permanently altered through systematic desensitization to suffering and death that resulted from casual application of superior technology to situations that could have been addressed through conventional approaches that respected other people's autonomy and right to exist without interference from beings whose power exceeded their wisdom and moral development. The capture that delivered Rick Sanchez into the custody of the Galactic Federation was not the result of superior tactical planning or overwhelming military force, but rather Rick's own strategic decision to surrender himself when circumstances created opportunities for achieving objectives that could not be accomplished through continued resistance or flight to dimensions beyond Federation jurisdiction, demonstrating his evolution into someone whose thinking operated on scales that transcended normal considerations about personal safety and individual autonomy, in favor of complex long-term planning that treated his own imprisonment as a tactical resource rather than a defeat. The interrogation facility where Federation agents attempted to extract information from Rick's consciousness was designed according to their most advanced understanding of psychological manipulation and mental coercion, but their techniques proved laughably inadequate when applied to someone whose systematic exposure to multiversal horror and deliberate cultivation of emotional detachment had made him essentially immune to conventional approaches to breaking down psychological resistance through simulated trauma, or artificial recreation of meaningful relationships that might provide leverage for extracting cooperation. The virtual reality environments that Federation interrogators constructed to disorient and manipulate Rick's responses were navigated with casual superiority that revealed the vast gulf between their understanding of consciousness and reality manipulation, and Rick's own experience with technologies that could fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself, making their attempts at psychological warfare seem like children playing with toys they did not understand, while trying to intimidate someone whose capabilities exceeded their entire civilization's technological achievement. Rick's decision to present his tragic backstory to his captors was not motivated by psychological breakdown or genuine desire for confession and emotional catharsis, but rather by strategic recognition that mixing authentic, traumatic memories with deliberate fabrications would create psychological impacts on his interrogators that could be exploited for tactical advantage, while also providing him with opportunities to process his real grief and guilt without revealing information that might compromise his operational security or strategic objectives. The story that Rick told about his family's murder and his quest for revenge contained enough genuine emotional authenticity to convince his interrogators that they were witnessing psychological vulnerability and breakdown, but his presentation was carefully crafted to elicit specific responses that would serve his escape plan while maintaining his reputation as someone whose statements could not be trusted, even when they contained obvious elements of truth and personal significance that suggested psychological honesty rather than tactical deception. The fabricated elements that Rick wove throughout his confession served multiple purposes beyond simple misdirection of his captors, creating psychological distance between himself and the authentic trauma that had motivated years of multiversal violence, while also establishing narratives that portrayed his transformation into a cosmic-scale threat as inevitable, result of circumstances beyond his control rather than consequences of deliberate choices about how to respond to loss and injustice that could have been processed through less destructive approaches to grief and moral reasoning. The casual revelation that portions of his backstory had been fictional was delivered with the same condescending intellectual superiority that characterized all of Rick's interactions with beings he considered inferior, but the dismissal also served to protect him from emotional vulnerability that might interfere with his operational effectiveness by creating psychological connections to his interrogators that could be exploited for extracting genuine information or cooperation that might compromise his strategic position. The economic warfare that Rick unleashed against the Galactic Federation from within their supposedly secure virtual interrogation environment exceeded in scope and sophistication anything their security analysts had imagined possible, transforming their attempt to extract information from a captured criminal into the catalyst for systematic destruction of the financial infrastructure that maintained stability and cooperation among thousands of worlds whose civilizations depended on interstellar commerce and governmental services for their continued prosperity and security. The change of a single digit in the Federation's currency valuation system created cascading effects that destroyed the economic foundation of their civilization within hours, demonstrating Rick's understanding of complex systems and his willingness to cause suffering on scales that transcended individual malice or personal revenge in favor of strategic objectives that served his immediate tactical needs, without regard for consequences that would affect billions of innocent beings who had never participated in his capture or interrogation. Rick's observation of the Federation's economic collapse was conducted with the same analytical detachment that he applied to any successful experiment, and his lack of emotional response to the suffering and chaos that resulted from his intervention revealed how completely his systematic elimination of empathy had insulated him from normal moral reactions to witnessing the consequences of his choices for populations whose welfare should have been protected through responsible limitation of his technological applications and strategic decision-making processes. The escape that Rick executed during the confusion created by economic collapse was accomplished with theatrical flair that served no tactical purpose beyond demonstrating his intellectual superiority and psychological dominance over beings who had presumed to capture and interrogate someone whose capabilities exceeded their entire civilization's collective understanding of technology, consciousness, and strategic planning conducted across multiversal scales that transcended their limited perspective and experience. Rick's immediate transition from escaped prisoner to puppet master, orchestrating comprehensive reorganization of his family's emotional relationships, revealed the extent to which his imprisonment had been planned as opportunity for achieving domestic objectives that could not have been accomplished through conventional manipulation or direct confrontation with family members who possessed legitimate concerns about his influence on their welfare and stability. The systematic destruction of the Galactic Federation's governmental infrastructure was presented to his family as heroic achievement that demonstrated Rick's value as protector and provider of security against cosmic-scale threats, but the actual motivation for his actions had been personal convenience and strategic positioning, rather than altruistic concern for their welfare or commitment to abstract principles of justice and resistance against authoritarian oppression. The orchestration of Beth and Jerry's divorce was Rick's most sophisticated manipulation of people he claimed to love, exploiting intimate knowledge of their psychological vulnerabilities and relationship dynamics to produce outcomes that eliminated Jerry as source of opposition to Rick's authority while appearing to result from their own independent choices and recognition of fundamental incompatibilities that had existed throughout their marriage rather than external manipulation by someone whose strategic thinking treated their emotional welfare as secondary to his convenience. Rick's creation of conditions that made Beth choose between her husband and her father was accomplished through careful timing and presentation of information that highlighted Jerry's relief at Rick's capture while emphasizing Rick's sacrificial heroism in destroying the Federation to protect Earth and his family from continued persecution and potential future capture by beings who possessed resources for challenging his technological superiority and strategic autonomy. The psychological manipulation that Rick conducted during this period exceeded in sophistication and moral corrosiveness anything he had achieved during his years as an interdimensional assassin, because his targets were people who trusted him and depended on his guidance, rather than enemies who understood the stakes and had chosen to participate in conflicts whose outcomes would be determined through superior capability and strategic thinking, rather than emotional appeals or moral considerations about fairness and reciprocal respect. The confession that Rick made to Morty about his deliberate manipulation of his parents' divorce was delivered with casual indifference that revealed his confidence that his psychological control over his grandson was sufficiently complete to prevent meaningful resistance or attempts to expose his manipulative behavior to other family members who might possess sufficient moral clarity to challenge his authority and demand accountability for his exploitation of their emotional investments and family loyalty. The threat that Rick presented to Morty about denying any admission of manipulation, if reported to other family members, demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of family dynamics and power structures that would make his word more credible than his grandson's accusations while also establishing clear consequences for any family member who might consider challenging his version of events or attempting to organize collective resistance to his authority and control. The existential crisis that Rick deliberately created for Beth through casual revelation of her similarity to himself was designed to undermine her moral boundaries and independent judgment by highlighting her capacity for casual cruelty and disregard for social conventions, making her more receptive to his philosophical frameworks and less capable of maintaining ethical standards that might protect her family from his most destructive influences and manipulative strategies. Rick's presentation of Beth's childhood inventions as evidence of her inherent brilliance and creativity was accompanied by philosophical arguments about the artificial nature of conventional morality and social constraints that limited exceptional individuals from achieving their full potential through applications of superior intelligence and technological capability that transcended normal ethical categories and community obligations. The clone technology that Rick offered Beth as solution to her conflicted feelings about family responsibility represented his ultimate expression of nihilistic worldview applied to intimate human relationships, eliminating the need for difficult choices about competing priorities by creating artificial copies that could handle domestic obligations, while she pursued personal fulfillment through adventures that would satisfy her intellectual curiosity and desire for experiences that transcended conventional limitations. Rick's motivations for offering Beth the cloning option revealed the internal contradictions that characterized his approach to family relationships throughout this period, as his genuine desire to provide opportunities for happiness coexisted with strategic calculations about maintaining loyalty and emotional dependence that treated autonomy as problem to be managed rather than fundamental aspect of personhood that deserved respect and protection regardless of its impact on his psychological comfort and strategic objectives. The decision to erase his own memory of whether Beth had chosen to be cloned demonstrated Rick's recognition that maintaining authentic relationships required ignorance of the extent to which those relationships were based on technological manipulation and deception. But his selective amnesia also revealed his fundamental inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his choices when such accountability might interfere with his continued capacity for emotional satisfaction and psychological stability. The family's brief attempt to establish independence from Rick's influence through temporary abandonment of their home was motivated by intuitive recognition that his presence had become incompatible with normal domestic life, but their inability to maintain separation from someone whose capabilities exceeded their understanding revealed their fundamental dependence on relationships that had become psychologically necessary. Despite their awareness of his binding, manipulative, and controlling behavior, Rick's response to their attempt at establishing boundaries revealed both his emotional investment in maintaining family connections and his complete inability to respect limitations that conflicted with his preferences about how those relationships should function, demonstrating that his love for them was inseparable from his need for control and validation that treated their autonomy as threat to his psychological stability rather than legitimate expression of their individual rights and developmental needs. The negotiation that returned Rick to his position as family patriarch was conducted on terms that acknowledged his superior power while creating illusion that other family members retained meaningful influence over decisions affecting their collective welfare. But the underlying dynamic remained unchanged, as Rick continued to manipulate their choices through superior knowledge and technological capabilities, while they provided him with emotional connections necessary for maintaining psychological equilibrium in face of growing awareness that his multiversal perspective made normal human relationships increasingly difficult to sustain. Through conventional approaches to mutual respect and reciprocal consideration, Beth's identity crisis began not with sudden revelation or dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual accumulation of evidence that her capacity for casual cruelty and disregard for conventional moral boundaries matched her father's own psychological profile in ways that suggested fundamental similarities that transcended simple genetic inheritance or environmental influence and extended into deeper questions about the nature of consciousness and ethical reasoning that applied to beings whose intellectual capabilities exceeded normal human limitations and social constraints. The dangerous inventions that Rick revealed he had created for Beth during her childhood were not presented as evidence of irresponsible parenting or criminal negligence, but rather as proof of her inherent brilliance and creative potential. That conventional educational systems and social institutions had been inadequate to recognize or nurture through appropriate channels that could have developed her capabilities without exposing her to moral corruptions that accompanied unrestricted access to advanced technology and scientific knowledge. Rick's casual enumeration of the weapons, surveillance devices, and reality manipulation tools that he had provided to his young daughter was delivered with the same analytical tone that characterized his discussions of any technical achievement, but the implications of his revelations for Beth's understanding of her own moral development and the authenticity of her relationships created psychological disruptions that exceeded anything she had experienced during her years of dealing with his abandonment and return. The list of Beth's childhood inventions included devices capable of eliminating obstacles to her social and academic success through methods that ranged from sophisticated psychological manipulation to direct physical harm, and Rick's matter-of-fact presentation of these capabilities forced Beth to confront questions about the authenticity of her achievements and relationships that had been built upon foundations of technological advantage, rather than genuine personal merit or natural social development. Beth's realization that her most cherished memories of childhood success and happiness might have been artificially manufactured through her father's interventions created existential anxiety that transcended normal concerns about parental overprotectiveness or inappropriate involvement in children's activities, because the scope and sophistication of Rick's manipulations suggested that her entire personality and value system might have been shaped through processes that bypassed normal moral education and ethical development. The philosophical framework that Rick presented to explain his approach to Beth's childhood development was based on arguments about the artificial nature of conventional morality and social constraints that prevented exceptional individuals from achieving their full potential through applications of superior intelligence and technological capability, but his explanations were designed to undermine her confidence in independent moral reasoning, rather than provide genuine guidance about ethical decision-making. Rick's observation that Beth shared his capacity for casual violence and strategic manipulation was not offered as criticism or warning about potential dangers, but rather as validation of her exceptional nature and confirmation that she belonged to a category of beings who were not bound by limitations that applied to ordinary humans whose intellectual and technological capabilities remained within normal parameters that could be managed through conventional social institutions and legal frameworks. The clone technology that Rick offered as solution to Beth's conflicted feelings about family responsibility was presented not as extreme measure requiring careful ethical consideration, but rather as elegant technological fix that could eliminate the need for difficult choices between competing priorities by allowing her to pursue personal fulfillment while maintaining her domestic obligations through artificial means that preserved the appearance of conventional family relationships. Rick's explanation of the cloning process emphasized its technical sophistication and practical benefits, while minimizing ethical implications and potential psychological consequences for family members who would be interacting with artificial copies without their knowledge or consent, treating the fundamental violation of autonomy and authenticity as acceptable cost for achieving Beth's personal satisfaction and his own continued access to family relationships that served his psychological needs. The choice that Rick presented to Beth between accepting cloning or continuing to struggle with irreconcilable conflicts between her desires for adventure and her responsibilities as mother and wife was framed as liberation from artificial constraints rather than fundamental corruption of her most important relationships through technological intervention that would eliminate the possibility of genuine emotional connection and moral development through authentic engagement with difficult choices and their consequences. Beth's initial resistance to Rick's cloning proposal was based on intuitive recognition that replacing herself with an artificial copy would constitute a form of abandonment that violated her fundamental obligations to her children, regardless of the technological sophistication that might make such substitution undetectable to the people who depended on her presence and guidance. But her resistance was systematically undermined through Rick's philosophical arguments about the arbitrary nature of identity and moral responsibility. Rick's presentation of arguments about the meaninglessness of individual identity across infinite dimensions where countless versions of every person existed simultaneously was designed to convince Beth that her concerns about authenticity and moral obligation were based on limited understanding of cosmic realities rather than legitimate ethical intuitions that deserved consideration and respect regardless of their compatibility with his technological capabilities and strategic preferences. The psychological pressure that Rick applied to Beth during their discussions about cloning was accomplished through systematic exploitation of her insecurities about her achievements and relationships, highlighting evidence of her capacity for cruelty and manipulation, while suggesting that conventional moral frameworks were inadequate for beings whose exceptional capabilities placed them beyond normal social categories and ethical constraints that applied only to limited individuals. Beth's growing receptivity to Rick's arguments about transcending conventional moral limitations reflected not genuine philosophical conviction, but rather psychological exhaustion from attempting to maintain ethical standards that required constant effort and sacrifice, while Rick offered technological solutions that promised to eliminate the need for difficult choices and sustained moral reasoning about competing obligations and their long-term consequences for people she claimed to love. The decision-making process that Rick established for Beth's choice about cloning was designed to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing opportunities for careful reflection or consultation with people who might provide alternative perspectives about the ethical implications of replacing herself with an artificial copy whose existence would be based on deliberate deception of family members who deserved authentic relationships rather than technological substitutes. Rick's time limit for Beth's decision was presented as practical necessity based on the technical requirements of the cloning process, but the artificial urgency was actually strategic manipulation, designed to prevent her from developing psychological distance from his arguments or seeking guidance from people whose moral clarity might interfere with his objective of securing her cooperation in a project that served his interests rather than her genuine welfare or long-term happiness. The internal conflict that Beth experienced while considering Rick's proposal reflected her recognition that accepting cloning would represent fundamental betrayal of her children's trust and her abandonment of moral principles that had provided structure and meaning to her relationships. But her capacity for ethical reasoning had been systematically undermined through years of exposure to Rick's nihilistic worldview and casual attitude toward conventional social obligations and moral constraints. Beth's ultimate decision about cloning was complicated by her growing awareness that Rick's offer represented not generous provision of opportunities for personal fulfillment, but rather another form of control that would make her dependent on his technology while eliminating her capacity for autonomous moral development through authentic engagement with difficult choices and their consequences for people whose welfare should have been her primary concern. The cloning procedure that Rick conducted was accomplished with the same technical precision and emotional detachment that characterized all of his scientific work, but the casual efficiency with which he created artificial copies of his daughter revealed his complete inability to recognize the moral significance of individual identity and authentic relationships that could not be replicated through technological innovation, regardless of its sophistication or practical effectiveness. Rick's decision to erase his own memory of whether Beth had chosen to be cloned was presented as generous protection of their relationship from the complications that might arise from his knowledge of her choice, but the selective amnesia actually represented his recognition that maintaining emotional investment in family members required ignorance of the extent to which those relationships were based on technological manipulation and deliberate deception. The memory modification that Rick performed on himself was designed not only to eliminate his knowledge of Beth's specific choice, but also to preserve his capacity for experiencing authentic emotions towards someone who might be an artificial construct created to manage his psychological needs, rather than genuine person whose autonomous development deserved respect and protection, regardless of its impact on his emotional satisfaction and strategic objectives. The psychological implications of Rick's memory erasure extended beyond simple ignorance of Beth's decision to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of love and authentic relationship when emotional investments could be maintained only through deliberate elimination of information that might reveal the artificial nature of connections that provided meaning and stability in contexts where cosmic awareness had made normal human bonds increasingly difficult to sustain. Beth's adjustment to life after her choice about cloning was complicated by her awareness that Rick's memory modification made it impossible for her to receive validation or understanding from the person whose opinion mattered most to her, creating isolation that was intensified by the recognition that her decision had been made under psychological pressure that compromised her capacity for autonomous moral reasoning. The family dynamics that developed following Beth's encounter with cloning technology were characterized by increased emotional distance and strategic thinking that reflected the corrupting influence of Rick's approach to relationships and problem-solving through technological intervention rather than sustained commitment to authentic engagement with moral complexity and the long-term consequences of choices that affected innocent people who deserved better than to be treated as variables in equations designed to optimize individual satisfaction. The Rick and Beth, who emerged from their confrontation with cloning technology, were fundamentally altered in their capacity for authentic relationship and moral reasoning, having been shaped by exposure to possibilities that transcended normal ethical categories, while revealing the way that unlimited technological capability could transform even protective love into forms of control and manipulation that served psychological needs rather than genuine welfare of people whose autonomy and developmental requirements should have provided the foundation for all family relationships and strategic decision-making processes. The torture chamber that evil Morty had constructed within the depths of the Citadel was not simply a monument to cruelty or expression of psychological dysfunction, but rather a systematic research facility designed to explore the fundamental nature of Rick-Morty relationships through controlled experimentation that subjected countless versions of Morty to precise applications of suffering, calibrated to produce specific psychological responses and behavioral modifications that would advance evil Morty's understanding of the power dynamics that enabled Ricks to maintain control over their supposed partners in adventure. The rows of suffering Mortys that Rick and Morty discovered during their investigation represented not random victims of sadistic impulses, but rather carefully selected specimens whose torture had been conducted according to scientific protocols that treated their pain as data points in comprehensive analysis of the psychological mechanisms through which superior intelligence could be used to exploit emotional vulnerability and moral innocence for strategic advantage and personal satisfaction. Evil Morty's revelation of the central finite curve's true nature was delivered with the clinical precision of someone who had spent years analyzing the systematic oppression that Rick's dimensional barrier represented, and his explanation of the mathematical principles underlying the construction demonstrated intimate understanding of the technological achievement, while also highlighting its function as cosmic-scale prison that confined infinite populations to existence within Rick's carefully curated version of reality. The brain scan footage that Evil Morty presented as evidence of Rick's casual disposal of Morty corpses across multiple dimensions was not intended simply to shock or disturb, but rather to demonstrate the systematic nature Rick's dehumanization of beings he claimed to love, revealing patterns of replacement and abandonment that transcended individual incidents of dimensional travel gone wrong and represented fundamental aspects of Rick's approach to relationships and moral reasoning. Rick's defensive responses to Evil Morty's accusations were characterized by intellectual justifications and strategic rationalizations that avoided direct engagement with the moral implications of his actions. But his inability to provide compelling ethical arguments for the central finite curve's existence revealed the extent to which his cosmic-scale oppression had been motivated by personal psychological needs rather than legitimate concerns about multiversal stability or collective welfare. The revelation that Rick had systematically murdered alternate versions of himself during his hunt for Rick Prime was presented by Evil Morty, not as breaking news, but as confirmation of patterns that any sophisticated analysis of Rick's psychology would have predicted, demonstrating that the transformation from victim to victimizer followed logical progressions that made Rick's evolution into a multiversal threat both understandable and ultimately predictable, given sufficient time and resources. Evil Morty's explanation of his own development from innocent grandson to cosmic-scale threat was delivered without self-pity or attempts at moral justification, but rather as case study in the corrupting effects of prolonged exposure to Rick's worldview and the way that systematic dehumanization and casual violence could transform even victims into perpetrators who possessed capabilities that exceeded their original tormentors' achievements in scope and sophistication. The countdown to the central finite curve's destruction was accompanied by systematic revelation of Rick's most carefully guarded secrets and vulnerabilities. As Evil Morty demonstrated his superior understanding of Rick's psychology through strategic deployment of information designed to maximize psychological impact, while also serving practical objectives related to his escape into the broader multiverse beyond the dimensional barrier. Morty's psychological crisis during Evil Morty's revelations was not limited to simple shock at learning about Rick's deceptions, but extended to fundamental questions about his own identity and significance within Rick's life, as the evidence of countless discarded Mortys forced him to confront the possibility that his relationship with Rick was based on utility rather than genuine affection or unique personal qualities that made him irreplaceable. The philosophical implications of Evil Morty's accusations against Rick transcended individual moral failures to encompass systematic critique of the power structures and relationships that enabled exceptional individuals to exploit those who depended on them for guidance and protection, revealing how protective concern could be transformed into control mechanisms that served the protector's psychological needs rather than the supposed beneficiary's welfare and development. Evil Morty's technological superiority during the Citadel's destruction was demonstrated not through superior weaponry or defensive systems, but through comprehensive understanding of the psychological and structural vulnerabilities that made Rick-dominated civilization inherently unstable and susceptible to collapse when its fundamental contradictions were exposed and exploited by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of its operational principles and strategic weaknesses. The escape pods that carried Rick and Morty away from the collapsing Citadel provided them with front-row seats to witness the destruction of the most sophisticated civilization that Rick's had ever constructed, but more importantly, forced them to confront the reality that their adventures and relationships had been enabled by systematic oppression of infinite populations, whose suffering had been necessary to maintain Rick's illusion of cosmic significance and intellectual superiority. Rick's loss of portal fluid and dimensional travel capabilities following the Citadel's destruction represented not simply tactical disadvantage or temporary inconvenience, but rather symbolic severing of his connection to the godlike power that had enabled his casual manipulation of reality and relationships according to his preferences and psychological needs, forcing him to confront mortality and limitation that he had successfully avoided through technological superiority and strategic thinking. The stranded condition that Rick and Morty experienced after Evil Morty's escape forced them to depend on each other in ways that their previous adventures had not required, eliminating the easy exit strategies and dimensional escape routes that had enabled Rick to avoid sustained engagement with emotional complexity and moral consequences that might have challenged his worldview or demanded genuine accountability for his choices and their effects on people he claimed to care about. Morty's response to learning the full scope of Rick's deceptions and manipulations was complicated by years of emotional investment in their relationship and growing recognition that his own moral development had been shaped by exposure to Rick's nihilistic frameworks and casual disregard for conventional ethical reasoning, creating internal conflicts about loyalty and identity that could not be resolved through simple rejection or acceptance of Rick's influence on his psychological development. The philosophical questions that Evil Morty had raised about the nature of identity and meaning within the central finite curve continued to resonate with Morty's understanding of his situation as someone whose significance in Rick's life might be based on convenience rather than genuine recognition of his individual worth and potential, forcing him to confront the possibility that his adventures and experiences had been orchestrated to serve Rick's needs rather than his own development and happiness. Evil Morty's final warnings about the consequences of challenging or interfering with his activities in the unrestricted multiverse served both as explanation for his assistance in their escape and as threat about potential future conflicts if Rick attempted to pursue him beyond the dimensional barrier or interfere with his broader objectives that transcended the limited scope of Rick-dominated reality and its associated power structures and relationship dynamics. The recognition that evil Morty now possessed capabilities that exceeded anything Rick had achieved during his years of multiversal dominance created new forms of existential anxiety that transcended normal concerns about physical safety or strategic disadvantage, representing the possibility that someone with complete understanding of Rick's psychology might decide that the multiverse would be better off without any versions of Rick Sanchez, regardless of their individual moral development or commitment to protecting innocent people. The destruction of the central finite curve had eliminated not only Rick's technological advantages and strategic resources, but also the fundamental assumptions about reality and identity that had enabled him to function despite the contradictions inherent in his simultaneous roles as protective grandfather and systematic oppressor of infinite populations whose suffering had been necessary to maintain his psychological stability and sense of cosmic importance. Rick's confrontation with the collapse of everything he had built to protect himself from evidence of his own limitations and moral failures forced him to acknowledge that his greatest achievements had been monuments to narcissism and psychological inadequacy rather than genuine contributions to multiversal welfare or scientific advancement that might justify the suffering and destruction that had accompanied his rise to godlike status and influence. The philosophical implications of evil Morty's revelations extended beyond immediate questions about Rick's moral character to encompass fundamental challenges to the frameworks of meaning and purpose that had sustained Rick's continued existence despite his growing awareness that his transformation from victim to victimizer had eliminated his capacity for the authentic relationships and moral reasoning that might have provided genuine satisfaction and psychological healing. The Rick and Morty, who survived the Citadel's destruction, were forced to rebuild their relationship on foundations that acknowledged the extent to which their previous adventures had been enabled by systematic oppression and casual exploitation of beings whose welfare should have been protected rather than sacrificed for their convenience and entertainment, creating opportunities for genuine moral development that had been impossible while Rick retained the technological superiority that enabled his godlike control over circumstances and outcomes. The stage was set for fundamental reconsideration of their relationship and its implications for their continued existence in a multiverse where Rick's assumed intellectual superiority was no longer guaranteed, and his capacity for casual manipulation of reality had been severely compromised by the loss of resources and capabilities that had enabled his previous approach to problem solving through technological intervention, rather than moral reasoning and sustained commitment to principles that transcended individual psychological needs and strategic preferences. The portal reset that scattered Rick across dimensional boundaries after evil Morty's destruction of the central finite curve delivered him not to some random alternate reality, but to the coordinates that corresponded to his original dimension, the place where his transformation from loving family man to multiversal monster had begun over 30 years earlier, when Rick Prime's casual cruelty had eliminated everything that had ever provided meaning and structure to his existence as a recognizably human being with normal moral responses and emotional investments in other people's welfare. The landscape that greeted Rick upon his forced return to Dimension C-137 was simultaneously familiar and alien, bearing the geographical features and architectural arrangements that matched his memories of home, while also displaying the subtle signs of temporal distortion and reality manipulation that revealed how his grief-stricken response to his family's murder had fundamentally altered the basic structure of space-time within this particular reality through technological interventions that exceeded anything normal human psychology should have been capable of conceiving or implementing. The red rocks and desert terrain that surrounded his original home coordinates had been transformed by decades of automated systems operating without oversight or maintenance, creating an environment that preserved the essential characteristics of the place where Diane and Beth had died, while also demonstrating the way that uncontrolled scientific experimentation could reshape entire ecosystems according to principles that served technological objectives rather than natural development or environmental sustainability. The house that had once contained Rick's domestic happiness was no longer visible from his arrival point, having been replaced by the sprawling industrial complex that Rick had constructed during his initial months of grief and rage to serve his obsessive development of portal technology and weapon systems designed for interdimensional assassination. But the emotional resonance of the location remained intact, despite the physical transformations that had eliminated every trace of normal human habitation and family life. Rick's approach to his former home was conducted with the mechanical precision that characterized all of his movements during this period of psychological disintegration, but his careful navigation of the security systems and automated defenses that protected his abandoned laboratory revealed unconscious familiarity with technologies and procedures that he had developed during the darkest period of his existence, when revenge had provided the only source of meaning and direction that could sustain continued engagement with a universe that had proven itself fundamentally hostile to human happiness. The garage workshop where Rick had once pursued scientific investigations, motivated by curiosity and desire to improve the world for his family, had been transformed into a monument to systematic hatred and the patient cultivation of capabilities designed for causing maximum destruction across infinite realities. But the space retained enough of its original character to trigger memories of the man Rick had been before Rick Prime's intervention had eliminated his capacity for normal emotional responses and moral reasoning about consequences that affected innocent people. The time loop that Rick discovered operating within his original dimension was not simply a preservation mechanism designed to maintain access to memories of his destroyed family, but rather a sophisticated form of psychological torture that had been operating automatically for over 3 decades to ensure that every conscious being within the reality would remain trapped in endless repetition of the final day of Diane and Beth's existence, experiencing the same conversations and activities without the possibility of forming new memories or adapting to changed circumstances. The artificial intelligence version of Diane that Rick encountered in his abandoned laboratory was not the gentle, supportive woman he remembered from their brief marriage, but rather a psychological weapon he had created during the depths of his depression to ensure that his guilt and self-recrimination would never fade through natural healing processes or the gradual acceptance that normally enables people to recover from traumatic loss and rebuild meaningful existence despite the permanent alteration of their circumstances and relationships. The AI Diane had been programmed with perfect recall of every argument, disappointment, and moment of friction that had occurred during their relationship, creating a digital ghost whose existence was dedicated to reminding Rick of his failures as husband and father, while offering no possibility of forgiveness, understanding, or the kind of emotional resolution that might have enabled him to process his grief in psychologically healthy ways that could lead to acceptance rather than perpetual self-punishment. The conversations that Rick conducted with his artificial wife revealed the sophistication of the psychological torture system he had constructed for himself, as the AI possessed all of Diane's intelligence and insight, but none of the love and patience that had made their actual relationship sustainable and rewarding during Rick's years as a relatively normal human being whose primary concerns involved advancing scientific knowledge while maintaining emotional connections to people whose welfare mattered more than abstract intellectual achievement. The cruel irony of Rick's reunion with his digital recreation of Diane was that she represented everything he had lost, while simultaneously embodying everything he had become, demonstrating his transformation from someone who deserved love into someone who could only create artificial substitutes for authentic relationships, while remaining fundamentally incapable of the vulnerability and moral consideration that healthy emotional bonds required from all participants. Regardless of their intellectual capabilities or technological resources, Rick's discovery of the temporal prison's true scope revealed that every person in his original dimension had been aging normally, while their consciousness remained fixed on the day his family died, creating a horror that exceeded even Rick's extensive experience with the consequences of uncontrolled scientific experimentation and his systematic elimination of moral constraints that might have prevented such systematic violation of innocent people's autonomy and right to normal existence free from external manipulation of their basic cognitive functions. The neighbors who had once known Rick as a brilliant but harmless scientist had spent 30 years trapped in repetitive loops that prevented them from processing the traumatic events they had witnessed or adapting their understanding and behavior to accommodate the fundamental changes that Rick's presence had introduced to their community through his casual deployment of technologies that exceeded their comprehension and eliminated their capacity for normal psychological development and social relationships. The children who had been Beth's playmates and classmates were now middle-aged adults whose bodies had continued developing while their minds remained frozen at ages when they lacked the cognitive sophistication necessary for understanding what was happening to them or developing strategies for coping with their imprisonment within temporal structures that served Rick's psychological needs rather than their own welfare and developmental requirements. Rick's solution to the problem he had created through his time loop technology was characteristically efficient and completely devoid of moral consideration for the people whose lives he had systematically destroyed through his inability to process grief in ways that did not require technological intervention and control over other beings whose only crime had been existing within the same reality as his personal tragedy and psychological breakdown. The kill switch that Rick activated to terminate the temporal loops was presented in his internal dialogue as mercy rather than murder, but the casual way he eliminated the suffering of billions of beings revealed how completely his years of multiversal travel had severed his connection to normal human empathy and his capacity for recognizing the fundamental value of individual existence, regardless of its immediate utility for serving his strategic objectives or emotional needs. The silence that followed the termination of his original dimension's population was not peaceful but rather accusatory, highlighting Rick's final severance of connection to the reality where his transformation from victim to monster had begun, and eliminating the last witnesses to his original humanity who might have provided foundation for psychological healing and moral recovery through their memories of the man he had been before Rick Prime's intervention had set him on his path toward cosmic-scale destruction. Rick's sterilization of his original dimension served multiple practical purposes, beyond ending the suffering of beings trapped in temporal prison, removing potential complications that might interfere with his use of the reality as operational base, while also eliminating evidence of his psychological breakdown and the systematic violation of innocent people's rights that had characterized his response to personal loss and the need for meaning in contexts where conventional sources of purpose had been eliminated through traumatic experience. The Rick who departed from his cleansed original dimension was no longer recognizably connected to the man who had once lived there with his family, having eliminated not only the physical traces of his former existence, but also the final psychological links to moral reasoning and emotional authenticity that might have provided foundation for genuine relationships and ethical decision-making that considered consequences for people beyond his immediate circle of strategic and emotional interest. The casual efficiency with which Rick conducted his genocide against his own original dimension demonstrated his complete evolution into exactly the kind of being who could destroy entire civilizations without meaningful psychological impact or moral consideration, revealing that his hunt for Rick Prime had transformed him into someone indistinguishable from his target in terms of capacity for systematic cruelty and disregard for the welfare of innocent beings whose suffering served no purpose beyond eliminating inconveniences that interfered with his operational preferences and strategic objectives. The recognition that Rick had become everything he once despised was not sufficient to create genuine moral awakening or psychological change, because his systematic elimination of empathy and ethical reasoning had made such self-awareness purely intellectual rather than emotionally compelling, leaving him capable of understanding his corruption while remaining fundamentally unable to care about its implications for his relationships or his continued existence as someone whose influence on any reality represented a threat to the welfare and autonomy of everyone unfortunate enough to encounter his casual disregard for normal moral constraints and social obligations that applied to beings who retained connection to their original humanity. The alliance between Rick C-137 and evil Morty that finally brought Rick Prime within reach of the vengeance that had consumed Rick's existence for over 3 decades was not based on trust or shared moral principles, but rather on mutual recognition that their individual capabilities were insufficient for confronting an enemy whose technological superiority and strategic planning exceeded anything either of them had achieved through their separate evolution beyond normal human limitations and conventional approaches to problem-solving through violence and systematic manipulation of reality according to personal preferences and psychological needs. Evil Morty's return from beyond the central finite curve was accompanied by evidence of his transformation during his time in the unrestricted multiverse, where exposure to realities that transcended Rick's carefully curated selection had expanded his understanding of power and possibility, while also revealing the true scope of Rick Prime's activities across infinite dimensions, where his presence had destabilized fundamental structures of space-time itself through systematic elimination of obstacles to his continued pursuit of objectives that served no purpose beyond personal amusement and psychological satisfaction. The intelligence that evil Morty provided about Rick Prime's multiversal genocide campaign exceeded in scope and horror anything that Rick C-137 had imagined possible, despite his own extensive experience with cosmic-scale violence and systematic elimination of alternate versions of himself, revealing that Rick Prime had developed techniques for destroying not just individual people or single realities, but entire categories of existence that might potentially interfere with his absolute autonomy and freedom from accountability to anyone whose welfare could limit his operational flexibility. The revelation that Rick Prime had systematically murdered every version of Diane across infinite realities was not simply evidence of his thoroughness or strategic thinking, but rather demonstration of his evolution into something that transcended normal categories of evil and malice to become a cosmic force dedicated to eliminating every possibility for happiness or meaningful relationship that might provide Rick with alternatives to the nihilistic worldview that Rick Prime had embraced as protection against emotional vulnerability, and moral consideration for consequences that affected beings he no longer recognized as deserving basic respect or autonomy. Rick's response to learning that his wife had been eliminated across every possible dimension was complicated by his growing recognition that his own years of multiversal violence and systematic murder had prepared him to understand and appreciate the technical achievement that Rick Prime's genocide represented, creating disturbing admiration for the efficiency and comprehensive scope of destruction that revealed how completely Rick's quest for revenge had corrupted his capacity for normal moral reasoning and emotional response to suffering that should have horrified rather than impressed him. The trap that Rick Prime had constructed for anyone who might eventually track him to his final stronghold was elegant in its psychological sophistication, exploiting the personal motivations and emotional vulnerabilities of his hunters while also demonstrating technological capabilities that exceeded anything the combined resources of the former Citadel had ever achieved through collective effort and shared knowledge, revealing that individual genius, unconstrained by ethical considerations or social obligations, could accomplish projects that transcended anything possible through cooperative endeavor and mutual aid. The arena where multiple versions of Rick competed for the privilege of reclaiming their murdered wives was designed not simply to eliminate potential threats to Rick Prime's security, but to force his victims to participate in their place in own moral degradation by making them complicit in each other's destruction, ensuring that victory would be achieved through betrayal and murder of beings who shared identical trauma and deserved resurrection as much as any individual survivor of Rick Prime's systematic campaign of multiversal terrorism. The other Ricks who had been drawn into Rick Prime's psychological torture chamber were recognizably versions of Rick C-137 himself, but their different responses to loss and trauma had shaped their evolution in directions that revealed the range of possible outcomes. When exceptional intelligence was combined with unlimited power and exposure to suffering that exceeded normal human capacity for psychological processing and moral reasoning, creating a spectrum that highlighted how Rick's particular choices had been neither inevitable nor necessarily optimal. The competitive framework that Rick Prime established among his hunters served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple elimination of threats, creating psychological pressure that made cooperation nearly impossible, while also ensuring that the eventual winner would bear responsibility for destroying other versions of himself who possessed equal claim to justice and resurrection, making victory psychologically devastating regardless of its practical benefits for achieving long-term objectives related to family restoration and emotional healing. Rick C-137's decision to reject the competitive structure and collaborate with evil Morty represented a rare moment of moral clarity in his decades-long descent toward complete nihilism, but his motivation was strategic rather than ethical, based on recognition that Rick Prime's game was designed to corrupt its participants, while also eliminating them through processes that served the architect's psychological needs, rather than providing genuine opportunities for justice or meaningful resolution of conflicts that transcended individual grievances and personal trauma. The escape from Rick Prime's psychological trap required Rick to acknowledge his dependence on both Morty and evil Morty in ways that challenged his fundamental assumptions about intellectual superiority and autonomous capability, forcing him to treat others as genuine partners rather than tools or obstacles to be managed, according to his preferences and strategic calculations about optimal outcomes that served his individual agenda rather than collective welfare, or shared objectives that might transcend personal, psychological requirements. Evil Morty's acquisition of the quantum tracking fluid that would eventually lead them to Rick Prime's actual location was accomplished through methods that demonstrated his own evolution toward Rick-level moral flexibility, while also revealing strategic thinking that prioritized long-term objectives over immediate personal advantage, creating an alliance that remained fragile and temporary, but was also more authentic than most relationships Rick had maintained. During his years of multiversal exile and systematic elimination of emotional vulnerability, the technology that Rick developed from evil Morty's quantum samples represented perhaps his most sophisticated application of interdimensional physics since his original portal gun. But the scientific achievement was overshadowed by his growing recognition that confronting Rick Prime would likely represent his final significant action regardless of its outcome, as the decades he had spent preparing for revenge had transformed him into someone who lacked capacity for finding meaning or purpose in ordinary existence that did not revolve around clear enemies and definable objectives. Rick Prime's dimensional stronghold was a monument to technological achievement, unconstrained by aesthetic considerations or concern for the welfare of beings who might be affected by the massive industrial complex that served his coat, multiversal activities, revealing the scope of his operations, and the way that individual genius could create projects that exceeded entire civilizations' collective capabilities. When freed from moral limitations and social obligations that might restrict resource allocation and strategic decision-making processes, the defense systems that protected Rick Prime's fortress were designed not merely to eliminate intruders, but to provide entertainment through systematic torture and humiliation of anyone foolish enough to challenge his security, demonstrating the same casual sadism that had motivated his original murder of Rick's family, but applied with technological sophistication that transformed individual cruelty into cosmic-scale force capable of reshaping reality, according to principles that served no purpose beyond personal amusement and validation of superior capabilities. The confrontation between Rick C-137 and Rick Prime was conducted in an environment that Rick Prime had designed to maximize his psychological advantages while minimizing any possibility that his enemies might achieve victory through conventional combat or superior strategy, creating conditions that emphasized his resource advantages and long-term planning while highlighting Rick C-137's reactive position and emotional investments that could be exploited for tactical gain through psychological warfare and deliberate provocation. Rick Prime's casual murder of Slow Mobius during their conversation served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating his continuing capacity for causing psychological pain to Rick C-137 through elimination of beings Rick cared about, reinforcing power dynamics that had defined their relationship since Rick Prime's original destruction of Diane and Beth decades earlier, when he had established his dominance through casual exercise of superior capability and complete indifference to moral considerations that might limit his operational flexibility. The psychological warfare that Rick Prime conducted during their physical confrontation was more sophisticated and damaging than any violence he might have inflicted directly, targeting Rick's deepest insecurities and most carefully guarded vulnerabilities while also highlighting the fundamental futility of revenge as source of meaning or satisfaction, revealing that Rick's entire existence had been defined by reactive responses to Rick Prime's initiatives rather than autonomous pursuit of genuine purpose or authentic relationships that might provide foundation for continued engagement with reality. Rick Prime's observations about Rick's choices and motivations were devastating precisely because they contained elements of truth that Rick had spent decades avoiding through constant action and strategic distraction, forcing him to confront the possibility that his transformation into a multiversal threat had served Rick Prime's interests more effectively than his own psychological needs or genuine commitment to justice and accountability for crimes that had destroyed innocent lives across infinite realities. The intervention of evil Morty at the crucial moment when Rick Prime seemed positioned to achieve final victory over his longtime nemesis was accomplished through deception and strategic misdirection that exploited Rick Prime's overconfidence and his tendency to underestimate beings he considered intellectually inferior, providing evil Morty with opportunities to acquire Rick Prime's knowledge and capabilities, while also ensuring that Rick C-137 would have the chance to complete his decades-long quest for personal revenge. Evil Morty's theft of Rick Prime's memories and technological secrets before allowing Rick to achieve his violent satisfaction was motivated not by altruistic desire to assist Rick's emotional healing, but by strategic recognition that Rick Prime's accumulated knowledge represented resources that could be used to prevent other Ricks from achieving similar levels of destructive capability, while also providing evil Morty with tools necessary for reshaping multiversal civilization according to principles that transcended individual psychological needs and personal trauma. The moment when evil Morty revived Rick and departed, leaving him alone with the incapacitated Rick Prime, represented perhaps the most significant gift Rick had ever received, but it was also a form of psychological torture that forced him to confront the reality that his greatest enemy was ultimately just another damaged version of himself who had made different choices about how to respond to loss, and the recognition that infinite power could not eliminate the fundamental sources of existential anxiety and emotional pain that motivated destructive behavior across infinite realities. Rick's decision to beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands, rather than using advanced weaponry or technological solutions, was motivated by need for physical and emotional catharsis that decades of planning and strategic preparation could not provide through more efficient methods, allowing him to experience every moment of his enemy's suffering, while also forcing him to acknowledge his own capacity for taking satisfaction from prolonged torture and deliberate infliction of pain that served no purpose beyond personal psychological gratification. Rick Prime's final words during his slow execution were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on his killer by highlighting the emptiness that would inevitably follow the completion of Rick's life mission and the recognition that his entire existence had been organized around reactions to Rick Prime's choices rather than autonomous development of meaning and purpose that could survive the elimination of external enemies, and clearly defined objectives that provided structure and direction for continued engagement with reality. The silence that followed Rick Prime's death was not characterized by satisfaction, relief, or sense of justice accomplished, but rather by the profound psychological void that Rick Prime had accurately predicted. As Rick discovered that achieving his decades-long objective had eliminated the primary source of meaning and direction in his existence, without providing any replacement purpose or goal that seemed worth pursuing through continued application of his exceptional capabilities and accumulated resources. The aftermath of Rick Prime's execution left Rick confronting fundamental questions about identity and purpose that his revenge obsession had enabled him to avoid through constant preparation and strategic planning, forcing him to acknowledge that his transformation from loving family man to cosmic-scale predator had been accomplished in service of objectives that provided no lasting satisfaction or genuine resolution of the psychological trauma that had motivated years of violence and systematic elimination of moral constraints that might have enabled healthier approaches to processing loss and rebuilding meaningful existence despite permanent alteration of his circumstances and relationships. And so we conclude our journey through Rick C-137's darkest moments, having witnessed how trauma, power, and infinite possibilities can transform love into hatred, protection into oppression, and brilliance into cosmic horror. Rick's story serves as a warning about the corrupting nature of unlimited power and the way that justified anger can consume everything good in a person until nothing remains but the machinery of destruction. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Rick's darkness is not its supernatural scale, but its fundamentally human origin. A man who loved his family so much that losing them turned him into someone who could casually destroy countless other families without hesitation. As you drift towards sleep, remember that Rick's greatest tragedy was not what was done to him, but what he chose to become in response. Rest peacefully in your singular reality, where choices matter because they cannot be undone, where relationships are precious because they cannot be replaced, and where love remains meaningful precisely because it exists without backup copies or dimensional alternatives. Sweet dreams in this beautifully limited existence we call home.